Now I'm gonna go leave because my dick is actually the nose of this fucking machine. Please behave yourself.
Greetings and salutations, my disciples of goofiness. It has been far too long since I've actually made a commentary that has piqued my interest and curiosity altogether, but today is quite different. The topic in question, along with my clickbaitish thumbnail, stems from a conversation that's been brought up during the Assassin's Creed showcase at UbiForward 2022, followed by a tweet reiterating said words.
Well, Danny, it seems we can't hide anything from you.
You can't.
So we're actually investigating how we will bring back standalone multiplayer experiences into the Assassin's Creed universe, all connected to the Infinity Hub.
I'm about to bust.
Now, as much as I am excited for the future of Assassin's Creed, as well as the standalone return of one of the chillest multiplayer vibes that gave me serotonin, I can't help but feel a tiny bit skeptical as to how it will be brought back and what changes will be made moving forward. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so it would be best to backtrack and go over a few things prior to UbiForward 2022. During the time period between late June and early July, an announcement was made that Ubisoft was officially pulling the plug on older online services for certain games of the past. This includes the purchase of single-player DLC as well as a halt to any multiplayer activities. Originally, the purge of said online services for past titles was to occur on September 1st, but was recently changed to the 1st of October instead before they're decommissioned altogether. Getting back on point, amongst the titles selected, the ones that stood out in particular to me obviously was Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Revelations, and the original version of Assassin's Creed 3. Pretty sure 3's online services were already nuked a long while back, but I could be wrong, so don't hesitate to call me out on that. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the multiplayer services for these games are old, like, actually old. About 8 to over 10 years worth, mind you, and yes, there are still those who play to this day and are dedicated up until the very end. You could make a compelling argument over as to how well it still operates to this day, and you may even bring up a few points in the process, which is completely fair. Either way, from what the article states, it seems as though the tech utilized during that period specifically has now been considered obsolete, and I quote, exploring what is possible to reduce disruption. It's as if they don't want to do so, but have to, unfortunately. Of course, I do have my own suspicions about this, but I think I'll just keep it to myself. Take note that the only remnant of the multiplayer that's left at this point that hasn't been mentioned is Black Flag's online services. Now, considering the fact that Ubisoft has referred to it as the most recent addition to the multiplayer installment some time ago, I'd assume that most of the old player base will more than likely not be in favor of this, but it'll be the only one out of the bunch that's available for now, so screw it, I suppose. Going back to the showcase, we've been given a lot in regards to the AC franchise, with a new game going back to the series' original roots, to different stories being branched out into specific settings that have been anticipated but also caught us by surprise. And to top it all off, they're all connected within what is called codename Infinity, which is believed to be a game at first, but is actually akin to a central hub that connects the experience with game for different titles and are able to share said experiences with other players. So, with all this taken into consideration, it begs the obvious question of the topic at hand. If and when multiplayer for the ACU returns, what would change specifically about it? What will be brought back in particular? Would the same concept return, or will it do a complete 180 and become something totally different than from what we've previously experienced in the past? Now, for those of you who are probably wondering what the multiplayer component is, how it operates, or what it even looks like for that matter, then allow for me to explain with some background footage provided by a few of my companions. Take note that along the way you will happen to notice a contradiction between how I am talking about it versus what's actually being shown. It's going to look as though it's out of context, so just a warning in advance. For the first installment, we have Brotherhood. Released on November 16, 2010, implementing a multiplayer system was at first odd. It was something you wouldn't expect from a series that was mainly focused on its single-player story. Impossible, you might even say. But it worked and it played out so well in the process. They were testing the waters and ended up creating something that will be considered unique, or dare I say, game-changing. It was completely different from your standard FPS and third-person shooters that most people were probably breaking their controllers over back in the day. Killing other players doing random weird parkour while role-playing as a Renaissance hitman? Sign me the fuck up. The way it worked revolved around using the concepts of stealth. With a lobby of 8 players total, your sole objective was to locate your target, eliminate them by any means necessary while avoiding any pursuers, and making yourself scarce as an actual assassin would. In this case, manhunt gameplay is shown with 2 teams, the pursuers and the targets. One group kills, the other does their best to hide from the threat, but that's not always the case. At most points, stealth was nowhere to be seen, or rather, it was there, but we just followed our own set of rules that justified our playstyle because why not? It was simple, but it was much more than that. Eventually, it would prove to become challenging later on. The second installment was introduced in Revelations, or ACR for short, and it was released on November 15, 2011, approximately a year later. This is my first personal experience with Assassin's Creed multiplayer. Just like its predecessor, the rules remained the same. The only difference was but a few changes were applied. Essentially, they wanted to up the ante and add more than what they had previously done before. Take a few mechanics here, a few pieces there, and just sprinkle it around to see what results were given. In terms of its gameplay, I would go as far as to say it was a bit more hectic. No doubt some of you may argue and say otherwise, but I digress. I'd assume that at this point they wanted Forward to act faster than ACB, but who knows. The third installment was a part of AC3, which was released on October 30th, 2012, and this for the most part is where I started to get involved with the community that was established during this period. Just like before, the same logic of stealth was still there, but it was different than what it was in the past. It wasn't exactly like ACB nor ACR when it came to its gameplay execution. It felt as though that it was starting to wander off on a different path, which I didn't necessarily mind as it flew over my head, but at the same time, it was something that part of the player base didn't necessarily agree with. This was probably the point where I have seen different opinions clash against one another, and not in a friendly manner. One side was in favor of the changes that not only came with the game, but for the series as a whole. The other, not so much. If anything, they were disappointed because it was not what it once was. Perhaps they just didn't have that same sense of fun like before. From a personal standpoint, it felt as though the game started to become much more forgiving than usual, if that makes sense. Nothing wrong with that in particular, since I assume Ubisoft had noticed the attraction the multiplayer base was giving off and wanted to make it more open to where anyone who was feeling unsure could give the game a try and determine whether or not it would suit their interest. The fourth installment of the multiplayer was released in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag on October 29, 2013, and this is the portion where I felt as though that this is the straw that finally broke the camel's back in terms of its execution. Same logic applied. Kill or be killed, stay hidden, and use whatever opportunity that was present at the time to move on ahead. But after a while, you start to notice that it's not the same as before. It was completely different. It had undergone a change, for better or for worse, and most people weren't fond of it. From a distance, it was gorgeous with a nice setting and looked smooth, something that actually caught my interest from the beginning. However, it played out differently than what we have initially anticipated, which threw us off but for a moment. Eventually, we managed to overcome said obstacles and figure out what's what, but yeah, there were a few interferences within the game itself that from time to time made it unbearable to play at certain points. From my understanding, over time, I felt as though that it had lost its sense of punishment, if that makes sense. It made me think that it was designed to be less difficult than before and cater to newer players, which, once again, it was not necessarily the end of the world, but it could have been handled a lot better. I just felt as though that there were times where others, along with myself, had gotten a slap on the wrist when we made a mistake, as if the game grabbed you by the hand and forced for you to right your wrongs, or perhaps I'm overlooking it. Regardless, each installment of the multiplayer had its own set of rules and functions that we had to figure out if you wanted to get ahead of the competition. They played out differently, and it was up to us to determine what was deemed appropriate during that period alone. In short, we just played around with it until we at least had an understanding of what was going on and went from there. The games have their flaws, yes, but it's how we look at them and attempt to use those flaws to our advantage that made it work out in the end, I suppose. And as cringe as it may sound, this is much more complex than what most of you may have initially thought. Think of the entire multiplayer component as a game of cat and mouse. Not only are you tasked with going after an objective, but you have to be aware of your surroundings and plan ahead accordingly. The game itself wants for you to adopt the elements of stealth and utilize it the way that it was initially intended for. I say this, but 9 times out of 10, we take that concept and just bend it. We basically abuse the code as long as it works out in our favor. Overall, from a personal perspective, it was always your actions that were graded based on what you were playing at the time. This is where I believe most of us, including myself, have fell short until we actually understood as to why certain actions outweighed the other. From the footage alone, most of you may be thinking why they were doing such tactics, but once you've gotten a grasp of the core values and what was going on in that instance, then it would make that bulb in your head light up. It takes some time before it actually clicks. For example, in the game mode Wanted, you want to make sure that you've killed your target in the cleanest way possible with whatever tools or abilities that you had during that time. In short, your score is dependent on how you've managed to kill the opposing player while protecting yourself. If you were, by the game's standards, considered low profile and managed to remain covert up until the kill, you were rewarded greatly. If you were what the game would have considered high profile and consistently broke the rules of stealth up until the kill without even noticing at some points, you were rewarded poorly. Either way, you would somehow end up attracting unwanted attention and had to handle it before the problem gets out of hand. Otherwise, you face the consequences made by your own actions. In this case, it was equality that was being valued here. In Artifact Assault, which is similar to Capture the Flag, you wanted to make sure that you stole the opposing player's artifact and bring it back to your base by any means necessary while protecting your own side with the tools and abilities provided. In short, the score of how many artifacts you brought back heavily outweighed your own personal scoring. This was a team mode after all. In this case, high-profile actions were often preferred rather than low-profile actions, and yes, you can sneak your way onto enemy territory, but the moment that you do, note that you'll automatically be added on their kill list up until they either find you, or if you return to your side. It was practically pointless. Even if you managed to grab their flag, stealth was thrown out the window. You had no choice but to run, seeing as you have a giant fucking marker above your head, and they will hunt you down like a pack of rabid dogs. In this case, it's the quantity that was being valued here. You see where I'm going with this? No matter which mode you played, there was always a set of standards that had to be met when participating in the action. That's how you were able to learn efficiently. Playing constantly was a surefire way to learn what little tricks other players had performed that you were incapable of doing so beforehand. From here, you can see how the series functioned and what made it different from most games. It was special in its own way. It was but an idea that soon came into fruition and flourished into something that I and many others enjoyed. But I wouldn't go as far as to call it perfect. Just like with any other game, it has its own share of problems that would prove to be a nuisance down the road, like networking issues, server ticks that would interfere with gameplay, bugs, etc, etc. Something along those lines, and take note that mistakes tend to happen. There will be times when certain situations are beyond our control. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that things have gotten better with each installment. I'll just state that over time, most changes implemented within the series were probably not needed. This isn't to say that there was not any good ideas. I can only imagine the shit that the developers had to go through just to make sure that things ran smoothly and still get berated by the player base because they didn't live up to certain standards. We all have our little nitpicks with each game and how they operated. The blueprints are there while Ubisoft is taking their time investigating as to how they will bring the multiplayer component back, but in good fashion. I'm certain they are aware of the amount of work they had put into this and would not want to see it go to waste. Hell, if they wanted to, they could just copy and paste ACB system for new gen stuff, slap a new and improved sign on it, and it might attract some attention, but I'm pretty sure that's not how it works. It can't be that simple. At this point, all it takes is to thoroughly research what made it at its best, what were the strengths and weaknesses of each installment, what can be scrapped and replaced, and so on and so forth. They do have multiple titles under their belt, so it wouldn't be out of the ordinary if they took a piece of one game and merged it within. It was done before, and I'm sure it could be done again. Not only this, but there was and still is a community, small as it may be, that helped newcomers along the way with their own set of guidelines, instructions, techniques, and commentaries that helped others like myself become knowledgeable of the game and how it worked in certain instances. If we're being completely honest with one another, to me, this was probably the best part that I liked about the game. I wasn't the only one who actually loved it, and it was welcoming. They were glad to teach others what tricks they used and what was considered appropriate in those game modes. It didn't matter which installment that you started on, as long as you were able to accept constructive criticism while stepping out of your comfort zone, then it was only a matter of time until you got the hang of it yourself. Of course, I wouldn't call it a safe haven per se, but it was more or less grouped with like-minded individuals who had a degree of respect for one another as long as they didn't overstep boundaries, if that made sense. It was a chill environment where we just poked fun at one another, sitting in our little Xbox parties or PSN group chats, competing with or against one another, and just having fun, just playing around. I've played against people who end up being my best friends who I've known for several years because of this game, and it's one of the moments in my life that I'm proud of. But, of course, just like with any other gaming community, we had our own fair share of toxicity, egocentric individuals, harassment, constant belittling of others, a shitload of drama, and other stuff of that nature. The list is kind of long, but nonetheless you have a general idea of what was being stated. We may have had fun, but there were moments where we weren't exactly perfect. In the future, I hope this is something that will change for the better. So, to summarize, Assassin's Creed multiplayer is currently being investigated to see how it be brought back, but as for when has yet to be determined. The only thing we can do now is just wait and see what plans Ubisoft has in store for not only the online aspect, but for the series as a whole. With new stories coming out, it's only a matter of time before we are actually capable of sharing the experiences with one another. Despite our dismay with the fact that the old generation of Assassin's Creed multiplayer is coming to a halt, there are still those, along with myself, who have hope that when the series does make a comeback, we can rejoice as we had before. Perhaps it'll change into something that's unexpected but welcoming, or perhaps it'll return to its original state. Only time will tell. Either way, I'm looking forward to what's to come. So, once again, thank you for enduring my rambling, and I'll see you all next time. Love you all, and peace.